I'm recording my homily for the 25th Sunday in Ordinary Time, 2018. This homily has given me some consternation. I feel uncomfortable giving this homily, not because of the subject matter per se, but I suppose it's how I'm presenting it. I think it's coming across in some ways as gossip. I have to ask myself, would I give this homily in the presence of the people whom I'm about to talk about? And I can't give a definite answer to that, and so that's probably gossip, so I'm probably going to have to go to confession for this homily. But I'm giving this homily, and I'm going to be talking about the church scandal again, and in some ways I feel like I have to apologize because I feel like I keep going back to it over and over. We had a priest meeting in the Archdiocese of Seattle, and we met with the bishop, and it was a good meeting. We did little small group discussions, and our table, I realize I emphatically disagree with some of my brother priests on some of this, and maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but one of the points that was made was that his people right now, they just want to move on, they just don't really want to focus on this anymore. And it was almost like, we got better things to do. And I've actually even heard, I think there's some bishops who've even said that, it's like we need to focus on other things. But when you really think about what Jesus did, when Jesus would walk into a village, I know I've said this so many times, but when Jesus would walk into a village, what would he do? He would notice the sinners, he would notice the wounded, he would notice the people who are sick, the people who are possessed. I mean, he immediately was always drawn to the wounded, and so I can't help but feel like this is where we belong. We created a very large group of wounded people, people who've been wounded by representatives of the church, and so I think this is where we belong. I think this should be maybe not 100% of our focus, but it should be a lot of it, and so I disagree very strongly with the idea that there should be other things we should be focusing on. So I guess that's why I'm preaching on it so much, okay? Yeah, why don't I'll just start. Okay, so one of the questions that's come up, and the reason for this homily is perhaps to give an insight in some of the things going on. So when Pope Francis was first accused, if you will, of being complicit in the McCarrick scandal, Cardinal McCarrick, who's now Bishop McCarrick, right? And he was accused by a bishop of failing to, warn people or failing to deal with the issue with this bishop, this cardinal who was out doing bad things, and so he's being accused of negligence, and this bishop, asked him to step down. He said he thought Pope Francis should retire. So Pope Francis' response was not necessarily to talk about the accusations, but he simply said, sometimes we only can respond with prayer and silence, right? Prayer and silence. Well, I don't think anybody would disagree with the prayer part, because we all desperately need that. But why the silence, right? Now, there's times we need silence. There's times when we shouldn't be, mouthing off, or there's times we even shouldn't be defending ourselves. And I guess he feels like this is a time, but when I talk to other people, and I have to say just my own feeling, it feels odd right now. It feels like maybe this is the wrong time for silence, because people need reassurance. People need to know. People need to know that the church has some level of accountability going all the way up to the top. And so when there's a serious accusation with details provided, it's like we want to know, right? It's like, come on, talk to us. So, just talking to a few other people and some other priests, they've all said the same thing. It's like, no, we need to know something, come on, talk to us. I think even Cardinal Dolan in New York City has come out and said that he's growing impatient because we need something. We need something. Silence is not sufficient in this moment, right? So what I want to do is I want to provide at least some thought why Pope Francis is choosing silence. How does it make sense? Why would it make sense? From his perspective, why would it make complete sense? Okay? Now, the reality is Pope Francis has not been silent. But you have to dig a little bit. And I'm not sure the media knows how to do that, or I'm not sure the media knows really how to listen to Pope Francis sometimes. Because he's a very subtle person. He often doesn't come out and just say something very clearly. He's subtle. He speaks he does it through the back door, if you will. Well, in his daily Mass homilies that he gives, which are not necessarily published per se, the media does pick up on him every once in a while. And so on his homily that he gave on Thursday, so last Thursday, so I'm going to go into that a little bit just to provide some insight. Because I'm just hoping this provides some insight to you is what's going on in Pope Francis's mind through the midst of this really horrible scandal. Okay? All right. And one of the reasons that this is difficult for me is because in the end I'm going to disagree with his evaluation, but that's where we're at. Okay, so Thursday's gospel was Jesus is being invited over to the Pharisees' house, right? And the Pharisees and Jesus didn't really get along, but the Pharisees were curious. They wanted to listen to him. They didn't necessarily like him, but they were listening to him. So the Pharisee invites Jesus over over to his house for dinner. And as he goes, there's the sinful woman who follows him. The sinful woman who goes into the house of the Pharisee, immediately goes to Jesus, practically crawling, right? And with her tears begins to bathe Jesus' feet. It says she anoints his feet and she bathes his feet with her tears. This is a woman who is profoundly shaken in her life and is seeking mercy and forgiveness, right? But all it says is that she was a horrible sinner, right? She was a sinful woman. I suppose we could assume what these sins were. It seems like the Pharisee seems to imply that these were sins either of prostitution or she's an adulteress, something along those lines. Now, conversation ensues. So the Pharisee looks at Jesus, because he's kind of rendering judgment on Jesus, looks at Jesus and says, don't you know who she is? Don't you know that she's a horrible sinner? How can you allow her to touch you that way? Right? See, it kind of implies a sexual thing, and it's like he's being tainted by this, by her. And so the Pharisee scandalized, and it says he was scandalized by this. He was scandalized, right? Well, Jesus responds to the Pharisee by using a story. And so the story is of a man who has two people who owe him money. One owes 500 denarii. Denarii is just 1 day's wage, okay? 500 denarii, and the other owes 50. So one owes 10 times as much as the other. And the man forgives both of them. And so Jesus' point is, who of the two would have greater love for that mercy, for that forgiveness of the loan? Well, it's the one who was forgiven more. It makes total sense, right? So Jesus then says, so between the sinful woman and yourself, speaking to the Pharisee, who has the greater sin? Well, the Pharisee was obviously the sinful woman. Says, well, then she would have greater love then for the mercy being shown to her. Well, the Pharisee's not going to get necessarily the fact that, he's the Son of God and he has the right to forgive. But he understands, I think, Jesus' point. And that is the one who has a greater sin needs more mercy and therefore will respond with more love to the mercy. Okay, so simple enough, right? Story is simple enough. Why is Pope Francis, or how does Pope Francis use this story then? Well, he applies it today, and he says that there are people who are crying out, scandal, scandal in the church today, right? Well, of course, because we have a scandal. But there's people who are crying out, scandal, and they're pointing the finger, right? And they're pointing the finger at another person, and Pope Francis says the people today who are crying out scandal about the scandal are hypocrites. because they're looking at the sinfulness of another person, just like the Pharisee did of the sinful woman. And so he says they're like the Pharisee, and so they're hypocrites, because in the end, all they really want to do is point at the sin of the other person so that nobody looks at their own sin. It's kind of a bold statement. And I do believe there are times when that's true. But is that true right now? So I think he's saying it in particular about the bishop who has accused him, right? The bishop who's come out and accused him of these things. I think he's saying in particular to him. He's being a Pharisee. He's being a hypocrite. He just doesn't want people to look at his own sins. And Pope Francis is being subtle about it, but he's really actually in the end being very direct. And he's saying that this is what's going on. Now, let's apply this story completely to Pope Francis's situation. Since he's taken the liberty of applying it, let's apply it completely and see if we can't get a deeper understanding of it. So, in this situation, who is Jesus? Well, I think that would be Pope Francis. Because Pope Francis is saying, these people who are accusing him, pointing the finger at him, they're being like the Pharisee. Okay? So then who is the Pharisee? Well, he would say it's the bishop who's accusing him. Okay, makes sense. Who's the sinful woman? Who's the sinful woman? Well, the sinful woman in this case would be McCarrick, would be the cardinal who did all these bad things, the sinner, the horrible sinner, right? Because that's what the situation's all about. Those are our three main characters. But the way this only works, the only way that this works, is if Pope Francis knew the sin, right? Remember what the Pharisee says, don't you know that this person's a sinner? Well, the only way you can offer mercy is if you know the sin. So he knows the sinfulness of Cardinal McCarrick, and that was the accusation that he was told it. So, so he knew it. But then he forgave him. He forgave him and allowed him to come back into ministry. And what he's saying is that just like the Pharisee was ridiculing Jesus for showing mercy and love to the sinner, that's what's happening here with this other bishop, that he's ridiculing him for showing mercy. He forgave him. Now, do you feel a little uneasy right now? I think there's two reasons I feel uneasy. One is, it feels like if I want justice done, if I want victims to have some path here, some way back into the church to know that there's accountability, transparency, and there's justice done and mercy towards them, that I have to turn my back actually on mercy. I have to turn my back. See, Pope Francis showed mercy. He forgave him. And now I feel like I'm acting in contradiction to that mercy. So that's the first reason I feel uncomfortable. The second reason I feel uncomfortable is because it feels like if I'm going to recognize that mercy, I can't then ask for justice. So, let's go a little bit deeper with this. Because I don't think that's a good answer. I don't think this works. I feel like the story that's from the Bible is not being applied completely accurately to the fullness of the situation, all right? Maybe to that specific instance between Pope Francis, this bishop, and the cardinal who did all the bad things, all that, so Cardinal McCarrick. But I still don't think it's an accurate way to apply it. And so I think to apply it in a more holistic way. So, who in the end, who is the one crying out scandal? Who's the one who originally came forward and said, look, there's been some horrible things done here? And how many thousands of people in the church have done that and were ignored, or were victimized even more, or were actually brutalized? They were, you can imagine a child coming forward to his mom and saying, Mom, this priest did this thing to me, this is a horrible thing. And mom saying, oh, come on, that priest would never do that, right? And so immediately not believing the child, or then getting angry at the child for lying, and when the child wasn't lying. Or accusing a bishop and then having the whole church turn against that person, because how could that bishop ever do something like that? Or the mom believes the child and then they go to the bishop and the bishop doesn't do anything. Or moves the priest to another parish where they're unsuspecting. So who is the first to cry out scandal? It's the victims. The victims were the first ones. They weren't necessarily listened to. They weren't treated correctly in a lot of instances. And so it's the victims. Now, does that fit in the story then? Because if it's the Pharisee, then we're saying that the victims are pharisaical for crying out for justice, for accusing. It doesn't work. Because they're not Pharisees. They're not hypocrites. They do have a right to that. Now, I want to talk about the relationship between justice and mercy. Perfect justice requires perfect mercy. And perfect mercy requires perfect justice. Because together they bring harmony to where harmony has been lost. There's brokenness, division, hurt, and harmony is brought back through perfect justice and perfect mercy. They are not in contradiction to each other. Okay? Justice to be done means showing mercy to the victim. Doesn't that make sense? If we want justice, we must show mercy to the victim. And so I think in the story in which how Francis applied it, there was no mercy for the victim. There was mercy for the perpetrator, for the evildoer, the sinner, but there was no mercy for the victim. And so I think we need to change the story so that we can have a character in that story of the victim. And it's not the Pharisee. They're not the Pharisee. Maybe they're a little bit more like the sinful woman. Not in that they've sinned, but in their desire. In their desire to crawl back to Jesus. Their desire to be loved by God. So I was talking to one of my staff members, and she was telling me about this tape that she'd been listening to on forgiveness. And the person said, when somebody's been hurt, that person's going to look for mercy and forgiveness in 3 ways. The first is from God. Now, why would they look for mercy from God? Well, especially if they've been hurt by the church, maybe they would blame God. They say, God, why didn't you protect me? God, where are you? Why are you against me, God? Because they would see the priest as being a representative of God, or the bishop as being like God, and they're against him and says, God, why are you against me? And so they could hold lots of resentments towards God. And so they need to be reconciled back to God. And we can help with that, especially by the actions of priests and bishops, and being accountable and doing things that would help the victims come back to seeing God as loving them, right? And so when they crawl to Jesus and they have their tears, they want to be reconciled there. And so that's the first wave of mercy. That's the first element of mercy, is to know that they're forgiven, or not that they're forgiven, but to know that they've been reconciled. Because, the thing is, even though they haven't done anything wrong per se, they feel like the outcast, just like the sinful woman. They feel like they've been outcast by the church. The second level of forgiveness, the second element of forgiveness is to forgive the perpetrator. Forgive the person who harmed them. And that's really hard. I admire anyone who can. That is really hard. But once again, I think when we look at the perpetrator, and if we're going to say we showed them mercy, okay, fine. But part of the mercy for the victim is justice that's being done to the perpetrator, because that helps the victim come back to realize that there can be harmony. They have a place in the church without being victimized. And so the justice is to know that we've created a safe home for them, a safe environment for them. And there has to be some level of justice done in order to create that. That's what the justice is creating that safe place for them and reestablishing trust. Okay? And so that's the next element to forgiveness and mercy, the church seeking forgiveness and reconciling with the victims. The third is that people who have been victimized often have a hard time forgiving themselves. Now, they haven't done anything wrong, but anyone who's known people who are sexually abused knows that they often blame themselves. They often feel like it was their fault, like they did something wrong, like they caused it in some manner. And we know that's not true. But for them to be able to forgive themselves or to be reconciled with themselves is part of that mercy and part of the justice, so that the message of the church comes out and says, it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. And so that can help them be reconciled. In the gospel this weekend, Jesus is challenging his disciples because they're arguing amongst themselves who is the greatest, right? And that's always bad in the Catholic Church and Christian Church, because Jesus would blast them and say, you've got it all wrong, right? Who is the greatest? Well, Jesus says, he doesn't say this. This is what happens. Taking a child, right? Very appropriate. Taking a child, he placed it in their midst and putting his arms around it. Now, this is true love, right? This is pure love. This is the love that Jesus is showing to this child. He said to them, whoever receives one child such as this in my name, in other words, one who loves this child in a completely good and pure and wholesome way, right? Protects this child, defends the child, receives the child as Jesus Christ, receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. And so I think this is a good little lesson for us in this. In the scandal is Jesus recognized immediately that a child is one of the ones whom we must look at to say how we receive that child is how we are going to operate as a church. How we receive the child is how we'll operate as a church. Okay? And so if we destroy a child, if we destroy the faith of a child, then we've gotten it all wrong. And that's why the church has to be so humble on this. And this is why I believe that this is so critical. How we receive a child is how well we're being a church, or how pathetic we're being a church. Now, the gospel next Sunday continues with this a little bit. So this is for next Sunday. And Jesus says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. Now, translation changes sometimes. Whoever would cause one of these little ones to go astray, to be harmed, in any way to cause them harm, it would be better for him if a great millstone were put around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. If a great millstone were put around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. Now, I don't know how you jive that with our new teachings on capital punishment, but I think what Jesus is getting at is, if somebody harms a child, if somebody harms someone who's vulnerable, if somebody's vulnerable in the faith, they're not in a good place. They're on a path that goes to hell, really and truly. And so yes, they need to be reconciled. Yes, they need to have mercy. But we need to do a lot of things to reconcile those who've been harmed. And that's where we're at right now. And I don't think we need to be anywhere else. All right. Keep praying for the church. Pray for your priests, please. Pray for your bishops. Pray for our Holy Father. Pray for your lay brothers and sisters. And pray especially for the victims in all of this. God bless.